All right. So are you out? Is there a way to just allow the because I'm continuing to hit admit all, but once I get started, is there a way that I can just allow people to come in without having to wait in the waiting room?
You'll have to change it in your Zoom settings. You have to however you created the Zoom link through your account.
That would have been Jennifer.
Did she do it under your account or did she do it under hers?
Well, she did it under my account. Since I came in as host, so
you can remove the waiting room in the Zoom settings. If you go into your Zoom account, you should be able to do it from there. And I think someone also put that maybe in the chat. Stephen, maybe. And the co-host could also just keep, yes, Emily, thank you, could also keep letting, so David could also keep letting folks in as he sees people come in.
David, can you do that? Since he's allowed to record, but
I think he walked away from the computer.
I know, he's just frustrated. David, can you allow people in?
I cannot. So I would say is click on the three dots next to me, and if it can make me host, then do that, and I can just.
But I got to share the screen because I've got a presentation.
You should still be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely can still share the screen. Ooh, it's one of those mornings I can't get my words out. Use your words, Felicia.
All right, so you're the host now. I still see share screen. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. Okay.
David, just allow multiple users to share their screen and no one else will share.
Yep.
So you're doing that, David? You're going to allow me to?
It should be all set.
All right. So now let me make sure. Hold on one second before I go to that. All right, so. And all right, I'm assuming folks can see that. Thank you if no one else shares their screen during this time period. So.
Patrick, do you want to put it on present mode so that it's bigger on our screens?
Now you're really challenging me. Oh, you mean, actually, yeah, because I don't actually, it didn't, there we go.
There it is. Okay, I'll shut
up. No, I need all the help that I can get. All right, so apologize for starting a few minutes late, folks. So here it's white people teach thyself. So it's the premise of me putting together this presentation is that I believe it's incumbent for white people like myself to educate ourselves on the lived experience of BIPOC people without forcing our friends and colleagues to recount their experiences, which is tiring at best and possibly re-traumatizing at worst. The purpose of this session will be to share and discuss strategies for how one can teach oneself about these experiences. And they will include reflecting on one's personal race awareness journey, practicing race and privilege mindfulness, excavating personal bias, and exploring extant literature and media. It is, and while I'm presenting them in an order, they are I've discovered them to be interactive and potentially mutually reinforcing. It's my hope that, given that everyone who's attending this is coming from a different starting point, that you will choose for yourself what actions you will take for your own personal curriculum development, for your learning journey in this area. I've got two important disclaimers. First of all, I believe it's important to realize that as a white person, I will never completely understand what it is to live as Black in this country. The best I can do is drive towards that goal while working to dismantle the biases in me and the systems and the biased systems in our organization and society that perpetuate the structures that contribute to the negative and traumatizing aspects of the lived Black experience. Tapping into my experiences that may relate to the experiences of others. And I have two examples for you from my own life that actually have to do with gender and sexual orientation. When I was in a master's program, I had two female friends who didn't know each other, but at about the same time shared with me that they had been sexually assaulted, and we talked a lot about it. And one of the themes from both of the conversations that I had with them was how their experience was that everything, the way they said it, everything had changed. Their living space had changed, the campus had changed, the neighborhood had changed. And while intellectually and cognitively, I could understand what they were telling me, emotionally and psychologically, it didn't quite connect. Until one day, I walked in my apartment, which had been somehow left open, someone gained access to it, and my stereo was stolen. Nothing else was touched, but my stereo was unplugged and gone. And while I processed the theft and wrote the appropriate reports and contacted public safety and all those kinds of things, I also came to realize that I could not see my apartment in the same way again. Now, that is not to say that this equates at all to being sexually assaulted, but it gave me access on a very small level to the emotional impact that led, I believe, to a greater empathy with my female friends. The second experience was also as a graduate student, but as a doctoral student in Bloomington, Indiana. I happened to be dating someone who was about my height and who had short hair, and we were walking hand in hand down the street in Bloomington, Indiana, and she happened to be wearing jeans and a jean jacket. When a car came up from behind us and someone screamed out the window, "Fucking fags." And we both turned in time to see the absolute anger and hatred on the young man's face who screamed it, and then the dissolution of that face when he realized that it was a heterosexual couple. Friends had told me what it was like to be gay in the Midwest, not to mention the East Coast, but at this, it was the Midwest. And having had that experience gave me a bit greater access. So what are the experiences in your life that you can use to tap in to gain greater access to the emotional impact of living in this country while Black? The second disclaimer is I am not an expert. I am someone who has been on my own journey and have tried to learn from this journey. And these are the actions and ideas as I reflect on my own growth that have helped me. So I've decided in this program to share them with you. At the end of each section, David is going to help monitor the questions so we can have questions as we go along. So the first step is to reflect on one's own personal race awareness journey. And by this picture, it is not a straight line. So the questions that I encourage you to reflect on is, what was the racial makeup of your upbringing, your neighborhood, your greater community, your school, your place of religious worship? How were or weren't races other than white represented in those places, and how were they represented? Such as, were the only Black or brown people those you saw cutting lawns or working at the mall, which was my experience growing up? When did you come to realize that race matters in our society and culture? And what were some of the primary influences beyond the general influence of living in a racist society? What were the primary influences regarding your knowledge of and beliefs about race? So to share a little bit about my journey, I grew up on Long Island. Long Island to this day is among the most segregated places by town in the United States. Say the name of the town, and most often it can be labeled Black or white. Freeport, Uniondale, Roosevelt, Hempstead, Black. Garden City, Oceanside, Baldwin, Levittown, white. I grew up in East Meadow and graduated high school in 1974. There were 783 members of my graduating class, only one of whom was Black. My parents grew up in Manhattan. My grandparents were immigrants from Ireland. My mom grew up in an immigrant mixed neighborhood on the Upper East Side. My dad lived in Midtown, which was mainly Irish. The neighborhood I grew up in was a mixture of Catholic, mainly Irish and Italian, Protestant, and Jewish. That was the extent of the diversity. My father, Raymond J. Love, known to us kids as RJL because that's how he signed his letters to us, was a complicated and damaged man. He was a bright guy, but only graduated from high school. He worked 2 full-time jobs for 19 years in construction and on the railroad in New York City. He was an alcoholic and emotionally abusive. He also strongly emphasized education, was fiscally conservative, and ardently anti-abortion. In fact, he was arrested 1 or 2 times for his anti-abortion activities. But he was very clear about issues of equality despite moving to a totally white suburb. I will focus on race, but his surprising lack of homophobia also impacted me and my siblings. There are 2 race experiences that stand out for me growing up. The first has to do with James Joseph and his 2 sons. As I mentioned, my dad worked 2 jobs. One was in construction. He operated a bulldozer. He was a member of a union. It was completely white, probably mostly Irish Catholic. Laborers, day laborers on construction sites were where any diversity, any non-white people worked. They were lower paying jobs, not union represented. My father became friends with James Joseph, a man who was from the Caribbean and a Black man from the Caribbean. And they came to connect on the fact that they had 2 sons the same age. I also had 3 sisters. And one Sunday morning, he had invited James and his 2 sons to come out and spend this Sunday afternoon in this summer day playing in the pool with his 2 sons. So one morning, my brother and I piled into the station wagon and drove into a neighborhood in New York City, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I don't know where it was, but this was the mid-1960s. It could have been Bedford-Stuyvesant, could have been Harlem at the time, could have been the South Bronx. I don't know where it was, but it was a neighborhood filled with Black faces. And James and his sons lived on the 3rd or 4th floor of a very damaged building in my young eyes. I remember walking up a stairwell that was graffiti covered and damaged into a neat and proper apartment. We collected them, came down, drove back, spent the day in the pool playing. So that's a memory, but it was reinforced because a couple of years later, I learned through my mother that a week later, a group of neighbors organized and came to meet with my father to ask him if he was intending to sell his house. Because blockbusting, the idea that a realtor would try to convince a white family to sell to a black family specifically in order to drive the other white people out and turn over the houses was something of great concern, apparently, on Long Island. My father sat calmly listening to them and then told them that yes, he was intending to sell his house and that they should get out of the neighborhood as quickly as possible. He had no intention of selling the house. He stayed there until long after my mother passed away and he moved in with my sister. So he stayed in the neighborhood, although I do recall there were a couple of people who moved out of the neighborhood. So that was one experience. The other experience that my siblings and I still talk about had to do with this Broadway show. My father worked 2 jobs. He didn't have a lot of time off, but once in a very great while, he and my mother would get an aunt or an uncle to watch us, and they would go in and see a Broadway show. And if they liked it, I suppose they bought the soundtrack. And then we came to memorize every song, since that's all they played for months at a time. But there was one night at dinner, we all recall, when my father had the album on, and he played the same song over and over and over again. The name of the song is "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught," and this is the first set of lyrics. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are ugly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. Every time he would play it, it would play through, and he would say, "That is not how we think in this house," and he would play it again. He played it probably a dozen times. And I know within the last year, my family, my siblings and I, my remaining siblings and I have talked about that experience. So among the racist society that I lived in, this powerful person in my life laid an alternative foundation. In looking back, when I moved out of my house after graduating from community college, I didn't think twice about sharing a house with an African-American guy I worked with and a very out gay man. As I moved on, I shared suites on campus with friends who were people of color. When I reflect back on that time period up through my mid-20s, I could see that I had an openness to diversity and diverse people in my life, but still not a high degree of understanding about and awareness of the lived experiences despite the relationships that I had. And I was definitely still pretty blind, very blind to the privilege afforded to me as a white person. So again, these are the reflection questions that, looking at the racial makeup, what were the non-white, how were non-white races represented? When did race become an issue that mattered? And did you have influences in your own life, I guess positively or negatively, that stand out beyond the background influences that shape us all? I want to stop now to see if David, if there are any questions from anyone.
Right now, no, but we could either have folks log them in the chat, or right now they can unmute themselves to ask directly.
Either one works for me. All right. Let me go on to the next section. Practicing race and privilege mindfulness. Obviously, what this requires is that as a white person in our society, accepting that we are afforded unearned privileges. If we find this difficult to accept, then perhaps a first step is to reflect on the unfair burdens placed on Black people in our society. For me, a crystallizing moment and experience came in reading Peggy McIntosh's article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. This was first published in 1989. I was in my doctoral program at the time, and it put into words what I had been learning from friends and colleagues of color since about 1982, when I was first a member of a truly racially and ethnically diverse staff, which was at SUNY Stony Brook, in my second professional job. Up to that point, my privilege had been pretty invisible to me. Sure, I felt good about myself being the first in my family to pursue a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree. Sure, I didn't know much about the rules of the higher ed game as people whose parents had gone to college, but being white and being male gave me a tremendous advantage. Faculty didn't know I was first generation. Faculty and staff just naturally slotted me into a category of a person to be listened to and considered and not ignored. While I wasn't seeing the privilege afforded me necessarily, or it didn't really come to consciousness, it was much easier to see the biases that my colleagues and friends who were women and people of color had to deal with. I could see how faculty would pass over them when they wished to contribute in class or ignore or comment, or pass over them at staff meetings. I could hear the assumptions voiced in RA selection process about students of color, some of which sadly at the time I didn't counter. I heard stories from friends about, especially when on Long Island, about shopping while Black on Long Island or driving while Black on Long Island. But unpacking the invisible knapsack was the eye-opener for me and my doctoral colleagues especially. It was the first clear description and challenge to us to look at the other side of the coin. There is bias and discrimination on one side, which we could see and we could decry and attempt to change. But there is benefit and privilege for us on the other. This was a bit harder to accept and generated uncomfortable emotions in us, shame, guilt, embarrassment that we had to work through. But by accepting that privilege existed and impacted my life, I also had to give up the myth of meritocracy, that there had been times and circumstances where I had attained something, not just through effort and hard work, but aided and abetted by the color of my skin or my sex. This represents unearned power that is conferred to us as white people and also as men systemically. But I also had learned that I had to be careful about how I came to generate awareness in staffs that I worked with. And one of those has to do with the concept of privilege walks, which I had first been exposed to as a professional staff person and then used. But in conversations with BIPOC friends and colleagues, it came to represent for me another learning experience provided to me and my white colleagues by BIPOC people, because as you can see, for those of you who have not done a privilege walk, generally everyone starts on the same line and a series of statements are made that if they reflect your experience, you step forward. If they don't reflect your experience, you step backwards. And so it comes to be seen that the white, male, straight, Christian, depending on the focus of the particular exercise, tend to move forward, whereas those in marginalized group tend to step backwards, in essence, outing themselves about the lack of privilege that they have. So while the power is when white people see how much more privilege they have than others, it does require others to share their lack of privilege and only reinforce it. So I have come to use a different exercise developed by Meg Bolger, which I first discovered in the Social Justice Toolbox, which she calls privilege for sale. This is an exercise where groups of mixed group of people, ideally, are provided a list of, could be 20, 25 privileges, and a certain amount of money that they as a group need to decide which of those privileges they are going to buy, which leads to a much more robust conversation among people of different races or sexes or sexual orientations about the impact of such privilege. So the actions when it comes to identifying privilege, certainly there's, still today, because I read it in preparation for this, there are many articles about privilege and unearned power, probably many more sophisticated than Peggy McIntosh's initial article, but I could still, having read it, it still holds some power. There are some things I'm sure she would have changed here all these 30 years later. And identify those privileges that you benefit from. As you enhance your mindfulness, if it the same way works for you that it has for me, I came to experience more pressure to shift and adjust my perspective on my everyday experiences. It doesn't guarantee change, but there is pressure, and that's part of the mindfulness. The more we raise our awareness about the privileges afforded us, the more likely are that we're going to see them in real time and perhaps take steps and actions to change them. Again, mindfulness and awareness do not guarantee change. It is really up to us. Any questions at this point?
We don't have a new question as to this section, but one from the previous section, which is one person reflected on, Eileen reflected on much of her imagery coming from media, from television, and sort of wondered if you had so many insights to that, both from your own development, but also as you've seen that change.
I absolutely do. The fourth section is on literature and media. So I'll have a couple of comments. So I'll hold off till then, but that's clearly the water in which we swim, which is invisible often to the fish, is media, which is only, obviously I'm much older than people who are attending this, those of you who are students. So I've seen how media has changed over time and expanded its influence over time, but I'll have more to say about that briefly. So again, just to reiterate here, to read, to reflect, and again, this is from my experience. I have found that journaling for me has been a powerful way of making sense of things in my world. I professionally journal, I personally journal, I sometimes combine the two. Because it also gives me an opportunity to look back on experiences that I've had and revisit some experiences that I've had and how I've reacted or not reacted or not acted in particular time periods, which I believe has helped my growth and development in this area. So it is something that in my job as on the faculty side, preparing professionals, I always encourage them to keep a reflective professional journal. I obviously would do the same thing here.
Patrick, we have one more question here,
Yeah.
Which is, how do you respond to resistance, particularly from fellow staff members, when engaging in activities, for example, like the one you mentioned, the privilege sale?
Oh, well, first, one of the things just about resistance in general, because I went through my life as someone who sort of just about checks off all the sort of dominant boxes, non-marginalized boxes, in the fact that I'm white, straight, that is the same thing as Christian, male, that I could speak about my experiences in such a way, and it's why I've sort of taken the tack that I have here, as opposed to telling someone about them and what they should do. So I invite them to try to understand from my perspective why I see that I have privilege as a white person or as a straight person, without forcing them to come to grips with the fact that they also have that same privilege if indeed they are straight or white or Christian in this particular society. Now, as far as staff resistance to the, when I have I guess part of it is I anticipate resistance anytime I do any kind of work or exercise relating to people changing perspectives. So certainly related to issues of race and difference in that regard, but even in my organizational work. And so whether it's co-facilitators that anticipating resistance and allowing for resistance, knowing that if we can get someone who is expressing resistance, to me, that's almost better and a step forward than someone who experiences resistance and keeps it to themselves and then goes away still holding firmly to that resistance. So I take the long view of someone who expresses some degree of resistance and allow them the space to share that. Share, if I've done a good job with my co-facilitators, we're sharing from our perspectives and invite them into further reflection or further conversation or to look at it from an alternative perspective without telling them that they're wrong as best we can, depending, there are extreme things that are said that need to be confronted and addressed, but we generally handle those in the ground rules that are set ahead of time. So, but I have found that by allowing people the freedom to resist, it also then doesn't force them into a hardened state. They're allowed to more lightly hold that resistance. And I can't say for sure, but I do believe that there's more openness when they see reasonable people sharing, and especially part of the privilege of being white and male and straight is, and I've seen it in the classroom as specifically as a male student versus a female student. When a female student has confronted sexism in the classroom against towards a male professor and have it kind of sloughed off, and then having a male student confront a professor on something sexist and look at it as though they've been hit. We have the power to use that privilege of being male to challenge other males, of being white to challenge other whites, of being straight to challenge other straights, to be more open. It helps us where some of our colleagues of color and other marginalized people can be, by those resistors, more readily discounted. So that's how I try to use my privilege because it affords me possibly greater access due to their own perspectives to dealing with their resistance. I hope that made sense.
And we have a sort of follow-up question from a different angle, which is from your position, how do you recommend BIPOC students or colleagues navigate questions, as the questioner puts it, that they might face in the workplace or class or in a public sphere where they're either asked to speak for the collective or questions that sort of centralize them and in a sense tokenize them?
Yeah, I mean, that's, well, part of what I see my job is empowering all students, so that if in a group, I won't say in class, out of class, but in a group where the facilitator turns to someone, a BIPOC student, and says, well, what do you think about that, with a clear intimation that this person is going to be speaking for all Black people or all Latinx people. That hopefully that there are going to be people, whether that student feels empowered enough to say, I can tell you how I would feel as an individual, but I can't speak for all other Black people or women or gay people or whatever it might be. But also having other people in the group being having enough awareness of recognizing also what's happened and saying, well, wait a second, perhaps we could all reflect on that, not just this person. There is typically, I have not found a magic solution to that other than the constant awareness raising of the students in the class and people who would be in the position of power of facilitating, because every situation will be different. But to empower that BIPOC student to come out and say, you know, I can speak for myself, which says, and I'm assuming the person doesn't want to call out the person at the front, because that sets up a bad dynamic. They may be in a position of being evaluated by this person, whether it's in class or in a staff meeting or something like that. So doing it in such a way as to make it clear what they're doing without in a way punishing them for it. And then if, depending on the kind of relationship that the person has, having a conversation later with the facilitator of that experience. Again, I don't have a magic answer to that very difficult situation, but that's some of what I've seen work in the past. All righty, so I'm going to move on to section 3, excavating personal bias. And I used excavation specifically because it's not, to me, discovering or awareness raising or whatever, quite frankly, sounds too easy. I think part of why I chose excavation, and specifically this picture of archaeological excavation, because when I first looked for a photo, I had big, powerful machines that dig huge swaths out of the earth for excavation. But for me, if we're going to excavate the personal biases that exist within us, they are subtly out of sight. They lurk typically just beneath the surface, and they require sort of finer tools to be aware and more sensitive awareness. So the idea here is to identify them and then reduce unconscious attitudes and biases. And it's just not an easy task. It is a permanent, long-term process that needs time and attention. And it requires non-defensiveness in the face of discovered bias. So let me start with a riddle that some of you may have seen. A father and son get in a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies. The boy is taken to the operating room and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this boy because he's my son. How is this possible? This riddle still works today, 30 years after the first time that I heard it. And it works with a wide variety of people. And there will be all sorts of answers to this. For those of you who don't know the answer is because the surgeon is the boy's mother. And it works because of the gender bias that persists pervasively throughout our society. And it still works today, despite, I don't know how many, there are probably more female surgeons today than there were 30 years ago, but it still works because of that. And I have had very strong female feminist friends, not immediately identified that the surgeon was the person's mother, because they are as influenced by the gender bias in our society as others. I use a particular, I tell a story on myself. When I was in my doctoral program and learning qualitative methodology, at the time, there were two dominant textbooks used to teach qualitative methodology. And textbooks, as you may know, tend to go by the name of the authors. So there was Guba and Lincoln and Bogdan and Bicklin. I was being taught by Egon Guba, so we used Guba and Lincoln. But I was well aware of Bogdan and Bicklin and came to teach at Syracuse University and work at Lemoyne College before that. And I met the two couples, the Bogdans and the Bicklins, the four people. Janet Bogdan was a sociology professor at Lemoyne. Bob Bogdan was a sociology professor at Syracuse. Sari and Doug Bicklin were both education professors at Syracuse University. And my office was across the hall from Sari Bicklin. So I had known about Bogdan and Bicklin. I had never read the book because I had read the other book for probably 7 or 8 years. And it was in my second year of working across the hall from Sari Bicklin when I finally looked at the book and realized that I had assumed that the two authors of the book were Bob Bogdan and Doug Bicklin. And I was wrong. Sari Bicklin was the co-author, not Bob. And so I had assumed that the men were the authors of the textbook, despite the fact that it was 4 people who were equally capable of having written that textbook. So for me, it is a constant reminder. I utilize that as my touchstone of there are other biases that still exist within me that I have not yet excavated. And that is my lifelong quest to continue to find those kinds of assumptions that exist beneath the surface that influence my work in a negative way. Bias is a learned phenomenon, and it's reinforced by family, community, and especially media. Not just how a group is represented in the media, which can be problematic and often is, but the degree to which groups are visible, such as, especially when I was growing up, all the white worlds on TV shows. Research shows that people can be consciously committed to egalitarianism and deliberately work to behave without prejudice, yet still possess hidden negative prejudices and stereotypes. And these hidden biases can reveal themselves in action, especially when a person's efforts to control their behavior consciously weaken under stress, distraction, or competition. The worst time to have biases emerge. I'm someone who has spent a lot of time looking at the job search process. Again, I work to prepare master's students for the profession of student affairs, and therefore I want them to do well in their job search. We know from research that egalitarian-minded white interviews sit farther from candidates of color and end interviews up to 25% sooner, yet assert that they treated each person equally. There is assistance if you are interested in finding out about this is Project Implicit. It was developed 15 or so years ago through Harvard University, and has continued to develop and expand, and I'll actually share that expansion. It's pretty easy to get to. It's projectimplicit.net, or you could just Google Project Implicit, and they have free assessments to identify the degree to which you have implicit bias regarding a variety of issues I'll share in a second. But from my own perspective, I had done it years ago, and I'm not surprised, but even now I'm hesitating because it outs myself that I have a moderate preference for European Americans over African Americans, which indicates that I still have work to do. Now, even going in, you're asked to predict, and I'm smart enough to predict that I was pretty sure that that was probably still the case, since I still live in this racist society. But the stress I felt when taking the test, when I already kind of knew what the answer was going to be, was an interesting phenomenon. But I encourage you to check this out. They have expanded their offerings and the work that they have done. So you can see here, they have now this assessment, implicit assessment test for Asian Americans regarding weapons, Arab or Muslims, issues of weight, age, presidents, race, gender science they have here, and religion. So again, that is Project Implicit, and I encourage you, especially if it may not tell you exactly why or what your biases are, but that you have them, which will give you further motivation to do the kind of excavation that will result in discovering and having your own stories to tell about when you discover the biases that you have. So actions for this area when it comes to excavating bias. What can you do? Number one is to be open to the existence of unconscious bias existing within you. It would be great to believe, I suppose, to believe that one doesn't have it, but it only blinds you to its existence then. Be wary of first impressions and the impact of bias. Again, going back to the interviewing question, one of the other things that we know about untrained job interviewers is that they that they make their decision in the first 5 minutes or so of an interview and spend the rest of the interview looking for reinforcing evidence for that decision. And so this is I have my students take advantage of that because they're going to be meeting with many untrained interviewers to recognize that the first part of an interview, if they can make a connection with the person, chances are it'll come out more positive than if they don't. So beware of first impressions, learn about stereotypes, expose yourself to different and varied experiences. The first time I was invited and went to a gay bar was when I was 20 years old. And it immediately exploded a number of the assumptions and stereotypes I had about gay people and gay men and women, for sure. In our organizations, since this pervades our organizations, deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider decisions, reasons for decisions, with the expectation that we're looking for the possible influence of such bias. Question cultural stereotypes, especially anything that comes up in an organizational process. And a really powerful organization, and if one could monitor each other, because if I'm blind to something, somebody pointing it out to me and seeing that as the gift it really is, rather than a criticism, could really help each other in the organization. So I know we have just a few minutes left, but I want to, considering I apologize for being slow on getting things going, let me get into the last one, and then we'll use the last whatever time we have left for whatever questions. And I'm certainly open to any questions beyond this. So exploring extant literature and media. For many people, this may actually be a first step. They may read, see, or hear something that challenges their view of the world and specifically about race in our world. As I mentioned at the outset, the actions that I am suggesting are interactive and ideally feed off and inform one another. So my own awakening back when I was much younger, mainly in high school, early high school, came through literature. And as someone, I think it was Eileen, asked, I'm as old as dirt. So back, we had TV, we had radio, we had newspapers and magazines. The internet didn't exist. Yes, there were movies, but they weren't as pervasive. There were no streaming services. There were 3 channels, 3 stations on the TV. I know, go ask your parents about that for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about. So for me, it was really literature that opened my eyes. One of the first the things that I remembered forever was a book, Black Like Me. Ralph Ellison was who wrote this, and not that's the next book. Sorry, John Howard Griffin. He was a white man who chemically and through dye darkened his skin and lived for 6 weeks traveling throughout the Deep South as a white man who had temporarily turned into a black man. And he wrote a book about the experience, Black Like Me. That is something that as a young teenager, I found very accessible and connected and just moved me powerfully. Another, this by Ralph Ellison, was required in my high school, Invisible Man, which is the description of life as a Black American in the late 40s and early 1950s, which was jarring to a white kid in a very white suburbs. Right out of high school, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which challenged, it caused me to reflect back on the experience of my white upbringing where Martin Luther King was the good Black person, the good Black leader. Malcolm X was the bad Black leader. Reading this profoundly challenged that assumption. Other books that have helped me on my journey of trying to better understand the experience of living Black in America. Beloved by Toni Morrison, Between the World and Me, more recently by Ta-Nehisi Coates, Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. There's plenty, there's too much out there. Novels and autobiographies, popular movies, documentaries, so many videos. NPR's Being Black in America is something that I highly recommend. Even on Reddit, there is What's It Like to Be Black in America? And thousands of people sharing. There are just too many to list. So the good news for those of you on this journey, there is plenty of opportunity to learn without forcing your friends and colleagues to do it. But it isn't, to my point, my final point is, it isn't just about doing this, that you need to be open to being transformed. It isn't just about learning about what it's like. It's about changing yourself in the process of this education and development. So I'll stop there. I mean, it's up to you to commit to whatever it is that you're going to do. But in the last 3.5 minutes, I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. David, what do you got for me? Or not?
No, I've just thought, since we're pressed for time, and
Okay.
I'm opening up so people can unmute themselves and ask questions directly rather than trying to play in between here. We did have one comment from the previous session, which was as to your riddle about the car crash and the surgeon being his mother, could also be his other father. So.
Yes, absolutely.
So the floor is open. If anyone wants to unmute, they can feel free to ask questions.
No? All right. Well, I thank you for taking the time this morning. If there's anybody who'd like to have a side conversation, plove@springfield.edu. And I'd welcome the conversation because I am still on my journey and welcome whatever challenges may come my way. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Love. And I want to remind people, I put in the beginning of the chat, please fill out the evaluation. This will be very useful as we continue our journey on doing this work. And again, Dr. Love, thank you so much for taking the time to deliver this to our during our conference this week.
Sure. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks. And if anyone's interested, our next session is Exploring Racial Trauma and Black Mental Health panel discussion today. For those that are interested, starting at 12:30. We hope to see you there for those that are interested. And again, Dr. Love, thank you so, so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Jimmy called me.